Another Patreon question here. This one comes from Tim Labonte. He asks, as kids, when we would only get games as gifts or saved enough allowance, what did your game collection look like when younger? Who'd ever thought we'd end up with hundreds of games? I had a shelf of 15 games more or less. So to help me answer this question, I assembled the Metal Jesus crew, and we're going to start with Kinsey.
So my game collection growing up, if you can call it a collection, wasn't very many. I mainly relied on renting when I was little. So my initial game collection basically consisted of The Legend of Zelda, which was the first game I ever played. And actually when I got it, I wasn't allowed to play it because my dad had to beat it first. But then I got to play a lot of it. And then, of course, DuckTales. I'm sure a lot of people played this. And same with Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers. I also played a ton of that. And I think the game I played the most of on the NES ever was actually Rampage. It's so good. I played way too much of it as a kid, and I'll never forget it. And then I had, like, John Elway football. That was my game collection on the NES growing up.
My collection as a child, back in the day, was pretty simple. My first game console that I had in my house was a Nintendo Entertainment System. And I remember probably around 87, I definitely didn't have one when they came out. I remember my dad renting the Nintendo Entertainment System for our family and loved it. And I remember a little bit after that, our family getting one. And so my collection back in the day would consist of that. And I probably had half a dozen games. The games that I remember owning are Rygar, Solomon's Key, Kid Icarus, Castlevania, Super Mario Brothers. And I think later on I got Legend of Zelda. Definitely remember getting Legend of Zelda. And in 1989, so I don't remember having more than 10 games for the Nintendo Entertainment System. They were so expensive, you would get a game and you would love it, whether it was good or bad, for a long time. And I think the next console that I had was a Sega Genesis, and I bought it with my own money, mowing lawns and washing cars, and Alter Beast. And so that probably, a couple games for that would definitely. One of my first games for the Sega Genesis was Herzog's Zwei. So 87 to 89 was probably when I owned my own games in its infancy. Yeah, and I didn't own an Atari back then. No, I played it at my cousin's, and so I didn't typically own my own Atari until early 90s. And so, yeah, definitely. Great question.
So when I was growing up, I was only allowed to have one console and one handheld at a time. So I had an original Game Boy that was my dad's. That was the very first game system that I had. Then I got an N64, and I actually still have my original Game Boy Color from childhood. It is super beat up, in really bad shape. I had to replace the speaker a few years back because it had completely gone out. And I had all the Pokemon games, of course. I also had just a ton of Pokemon merch. I actually went back and I found some of the ones that I owned when I was a kid. There was this great Chinese knockoff place where I lived in Detroit that sold a bunch of Pokemon bootleg stuff, so I found one of these, the exact model of Pikachu figures that I used to own, and this talking Pikachu that you might remember from those really weird commercials in the late 90s. As for games, my N64, I had a gold N64, and I had a decent sized stack of games for a kid, I guess. I had probably like 8 or 9 games. Mario Kart, Smash Brothers, Kirby and the Crystal Shards, all 3 of the Pokemon games, I guess I didn't have Pokemon Puzzle League, so Pokemon Snap, both of the Pokemon Stadiums. Oh, and I had Hey You Pikachu as well as Dr. Mario. I had a pretty good amount of N64 games, but then I had to sell it all when the GameCube came out, when I wanted a GameCube, so that's all gone, including my gold N64. Eventually my parents started being cool about that rule, and I was able to get a Wii and all of that stuff, and I was able to have multiple handhelds at the very least, but I didn't have a ton of games growing up, but pretty good amount for a kid.
So, what games did I collect when I was a kid? Well, back in my day, all the games were coal-fired, and my idea of a video console was 2 sticks and a dead squirrel. However, I do remember that we got a Coleco Telstar tank combat game. That was so cool, had the 2 tank controls, and we played the hell out of that thing. And we eventually got an Atari 2600, and I was played Adventure on that. That was my game. And I think we had a Pong game as well. After that, when I got a little bit older, I got a Radio Shack TRS-80, the old trash 80 color. Programmed a few games on that and played my favorite, which was Bedlam. If you don't know what plug means, you're not getting out of that one. I think I need some more bourbon.
I really like this question because when I grew up, I only got gaming systems and games for my birthday or for Christmas. When I saved up my allowance, I actually just deposited it in my savings account, or maybe I bought a CD, but I didn't spend it on games because I wasn't really exposed to the gaming world, and for some reason didn't think that I could spend it on games. So my game collection growing up was mainly Nintendo systems and mainly just the popular games associated with them. So for the original Nintendo, I had The Legend of Zelda and Paperboy and Super Mario games for it. And then for the Super Nintendo, I had A Link to the Past and Yoshi's Island and other Mario games for it. And again, for the Nintendo 64, I had Super Mario 64 and Super Mario Kart, and I played the heck out of those games. It really wasn't until I got my first adult job that I spent money on games, and that was for the PS3, Xbox 360 era. So my game collection growing up was actually fairly small. I just kept all the systems that I got, which were the 3 main Nintendo systems. But I played the heck out of every game that I had.
Hey Tim, to answer your question, back in the day, I didn't get a lot of games, and when I did, I held on to them, and most of those were my PlayStation games. I had a Super Nintendo before that, but it didn't have as much value to me as the PlayStation did when it came out. I just fell in love with that system. So what happened was that's when I actually started saving my money when I got what little I got for allowance, walking to school, stuff like that, instead of catching the bus, saving any money I could just to get a new game. And I remember saving up for Resident Evil 2, and I was happy when I got that. Amazing game. But now, as I never would have dreamed that I would have had the collection I have now. It was never a goal to be a big collector. It's just when you keep all your stuff, you accumulate a collection. You just can't help it. I'm a gamer before a collector, so I'm not just collecting games just to throw on the shelf. I value all my games, even though I haven't got to all of them yet. But back then, I think the less games I had, the more time you put into them because you didn't have that many. So, you were playing most of the games. Now, I can at least say that I've probably beaten 70% of these games, but still, it's hard to get to play some of these games. But anyway, hope I answered your question without dragging on too long. Later.
Well, Tim, that's a great question. If I'm going to talk about my childhood games growing up, I have to move to the house I grew up in. This is literally the house I grew up in the background here. Now, growing up, I had a humble collection like you, 15 to 20 Nintendo games. I had some of the staples like Mario 3, Mega Man 2, and then I had a, kind of like how bars have a rotating tap list, I had some of those too. We had a place in our town where you could trade in your game plus $1 for any of their games on their trade lot. So I could bring in my Heavy Shreddin' plus $1 and trade it in for 8 Eyes, and I'd have 8 Eyes for a while. Then when I was done with that game, I'd trade that in plus $1 and get, a Russian Attack or something like that. It was nice that way, and plus with the rentals that we had in the area, you could rent games at like grocery stores. I didn't feel like I needed to own every game. The other cool thing was, that's how you made friends in school. That's how I made friends in school. I'd overhear conversations, them talking about video games. I'd butt in saying, hey, I like video games too. Or you'd have your friends where you'd trade off your games and you'd give up a game for collateral and you would just go that route. So I have friends today I've made from overheard conversations about video games. But yeah, my list was very humble growing up, and I didn't feel like I needed to own everything until I got a disposable income. Now I feel like I need to own everything. Thanks, Tim.
My game collection as a kid was certainly a little different. It looked just like this. It was full of hundreds of pirated Commodore 64 floppy disks. And the reason for that is simple, is because in my little town that I lived in, we did not have a computer store and certainly not a video game store. And so the only way to get software at that time, before the internet, was to get pirated versions of it. But to make it even worse, the only place in town that I knew to get them was from this really weird dude who lived out in the country in a mobile home. And I'll never forget this. My buddy took me out there. I don't even know how we got there. I don't think my mom knows. I don't even think she knows today, but she never would have let me go because it was really dark, really creepy, wood paneling. The guy was chain smoking. He had a couple different Commodore 64 drives. He'd dupe them for you, charge you a couple bucks, and you'd be on your way. You didn't know what you're buying. It was definitely a different time. Also, the bummer is that because they were pirated, sometimes they just didn't work. You know, you get home and you'd be like, oh, you know, it's asking for something from the manual, or maybe the crack doesn't work. It was kind of frustrating, but you know, that's what you did in a small town when you wanted a game on the Commodore. So that's a great question. I love that question. It's so fun to answer. Also love to know, you guys who watch this, down in the comments below, when you were a little kid, what did your video game collection look like? I'm sure the answer is going to be all over the place. All right, great question. Thank you. This question was asked by one of my Patreon contributors who helps support my YouTube channel and help shape the content of my videos. In addition to asking questions like this, they also get access to a private chat, an audio podcast, and early access to most of my Friday videos. You can also set the amount you want to contribute, and you can leave or change it at any time. If you'd like to help support my videos and become part of the Metal Militia, please go to patreon.com/MetalJesusRocks.